There are two versions of South Africa. The first is the one we see, a sovereign republic flying its flag high above parliament, declaring its independence from the podiums of Pretoria, writing its laws, electing its leaders, and deciding its future. But there is another version, the one we don't see, a quieter country, one where decisions are shaped in offices thousands of kilometers away, where contracts are signed in Doha, data is routed through Shanghai, funding is wired from Washington, and narratives are written in Brussels boardrooms. A country where real control often hides behind words like investment, partnership, grant, or aid. This is not a story about invasion. This is a story about influence and how it slowly colonizes a nation without ever firing a shot. Every government needs control over its own information grid. Its communications, defense, data infrastructure, and surveillance backbone. Without it, sovereignty is just theater. In South Africa, that backbone increasingly runs through a single name: Huawei. On paper, Huawei is a private Chinese telecommunications giant that entered the African market as a cost-effective vendor. But in practice, it is far more than a supplier. It is the architect of South Africa's digital nervous system. By 2023, Huawei was responsible for building or upgrading core infrastructure for all three South Africa's major telecoms: MTN, Vodacom, and Telkom. It rolled out 5G trials, constructed multiple data centers, and partnered with states-linked projects in small policing, surveillance, and even rural connectivity. Undersea cables, mobile towers, cybersecurity protocols all increasingly relied on Huawei's architecture. What seemed like simple procurement contracts quickly became long-term dependencies. Local IT departments began relying on Huawei engineers for maintenance and diagnostics. State departments, from Home Affairs to Correctional Services, migrated onto cloud platforms built or co-managed by Huawei. The company opened multiple training academies across Gauteng, KwaZulu-Natal, and the Western Cape, offering free certification to public servants and quietly shaping the next generation of IT bureaucrats. But it wasn't just technical infrastructure Huawei was supplying. It was strategic access. In countries like Uganda and Zambia, investigative journalists and intelligence whistleblowers revealed that Huawei technicians were directly involved in aiding security agencies to monitor opposition leaders. In Uganda, a 2019 expose by the Wall Street Journal revealed that Huawei engineers helped intercept WhatsApp messages and location data of political challenger Bobi Wine. In Zambia, Huawei teams assisted in tracking bloggers critical of the government, helping the regime shut down online dissent. The playbook became clear: provide discounted infrastructure, embed long-term service agreements, and offer state-friendly surveillance upgrades. In return, gain access to the nation's information bloodstream and, in some cases, its politics. South Africa, of course, is not Uganda. There is no public evidence that Huawei has deployed these same tactics here. But the silence is not necessarily reassuring. It simply means the public isn't being told. Because South Africa, unlike those countries, handed Huawei far more than surveillance software. It handed it the keys to the entire telecom kingdom. And the control goes deeper. Huawei partnered with the Department of Communications and Digital Technologies to help draft digital policy frameworks. It ran public awareness campaigns promoting its 5G networks, while simultaneously funding media briefings on how Chinese tech partnerships were non-political. In 2022, it sponsored a government-hosted BRICS cybersecurity forum in Durban, where its own executives appeared alongside state ministers to discuss data sovereignty and African resilience. Let that sink in. A foreign company with known ties to the Chinese Communist Party was helping South Africa draft national data laws, while running its servers and training its IT staff. What does sovereignty mean when your own data sits on someone else's servers? When your mobile signals are routed through infrastructure you didn't design and can't maintain without a Chinese technician logging in remotely? Huawei doesn't need to censor anyone. It doesn't even need to eavesdrop. It simply owns the pipes through which your voice travels. And in doing so, it controls what happens when the taps are opened or closed. In another time, colonization arrived with warships. Today, it arrives with firmware updates. The year was 2014. The ink had barely dried on what would become one of the most secretive and controversial energy deals in South Africa's democratic history. Behind closed doors, then Energy Minister Tina Joemat-Pettersson had signed a nuclear cooperation agreement with Russia's Rosatom, a deal that committed South Africa to building up to 8 nuclear reactors at an estimated cost of 1 trillion rand. That was nearly a quarter of South Africa's entire GDP at the time. The agreement was buried in technical language and shielded from parliamentary scrutiny. Its implications: colossal debt, long-term geopolitical entanglements, and full strategic dependency on a single foreign actor for a third of a country's future electricity. And it had all been signed in secret. But the secrecy didn't last. By 2015, investigative journalists and civil society organizations began unraveling the threats. It was F-Life Africa and SEFSI, two civil society watchdogs that challenged the legality of the Rosatom Agreement in court. In 2017, the Western Cape High Court ruled the deal unconstitutional and unlawful, citing the government's failure to consult the public or parliament. The headlines celebrated a victory. The 1 trillion rand reactor project was dead. Democracy had prevailed, or so it seemed. Because in the years that followed, Russia's presence in South Africa didn't retreat, it deepened. Rosatom didn't abandon its ambitions. It merely shifted its strategy. Public mega deals were replaced by quiet, persistent diplomacy. BRICS energy summits, training programs, strategic grants, and military alignment. Between 2019 and 2024, multiple South African energy officials, including nuclear technicians and policy advisors, were hosted in Russia for civilian nuclear technology exchange programs. These weren't just symbolic. They were part of Rosatom's long-term soft power campaign. Build loyalty, create dependency, and embed Russian technical standards into South Africa's energy future. Then came February 2023. While much of the world was isolating Russia after the invasion of Ukraine, South Africa hosted joint naval exercises with the Russian and Chinese navies off the coast of Durban. The drills, codenamed Mosi 2, included warships from all three countries and took place on the 1-year anniversary of the Ukraine war's outbreak. The signal was unmissable. While the West issued sanctions and condemnations, South Africa shared the ocean with Russia's navy. To some, this was non-alignment. To others, it looked a lot like strategic drift towards a bloc of authoritarian powers using energy and defense ties to solidify influence. And behind the smoke of military optics was Rosatom, still present, still lobbying. In 2024, they launched a new Africa-focused PR campaign from their regional office in Johannesburg, branding nuclear energy as clean, sovereign, and decolonial. They knew the language to use. Their messaging was carefully calibrated. Don't call it foreign control. Call it energy freedom. The truth is, the nuclear deal never really died. It metastasized, moved out of sight, into forums, friendships, and funding. The Russians didn't need South Africa to sign another R1 trillion contract. They just needed it to stay close. Because influence isn't only about ownership, it's about alignment, economic, political, and military. And that alignment, slow and patient, continues under a different name. It started with good intentions. health, education, transparency, human rights. For 2 decades, American aid money poured into South Africa's civic institutions. Through organizations like USAID, PEPFAR, the Ford Foundation, Atlantic Philanthropies, and the Open Society Foundation, billions were spent nurturing what was often described as democracy's second skin, its civil society. Between 2004 and 2023, over $5 billion was injected into local NGOs, health clinics, legal aid projects, university partnerships, investigative media houses, and community outreach programs. The United States was not merely a trade partner. It had become the primary sponsor of South African democracy's grassroots. And for a time, it worked. Investigative journalism thrived. Anti-corruption bodies gained teeth. HIV treatment programs reached millions. Constitutional awareness deepened. This wasn't imperialism. It was, to many, a lifeline. But influence always comes with conditions. And in late 2024, the conditions changed. The US State Department announced a dramatic shift. It would be slashing nearly all development aid to South Africa by over 90%. PEPFAR's HIV programs were restructured. USAID pulled its funding from over a dozen independent media and legal NGOs. The Ford Foundation quietly froze new grants for 2025 onward. And Open Society Foundation closed its Johannesburg office entirely. Just like that, the scaffolding beneath civil society began to buckle. The fallout was immediate. Anova Health Institute, which ran dozens of mobile HIV units in Gauteng and Limpopo, laid off over 200 staff in February 2025. Corruption Watch suspended its annual school report card project. The Center for Environmental Rights shelved litigation against mining-linked pollution in Mpumalanga. Even universities like Wits and UCT saw research partnerships halted, scholarships delayed, and library digitization projects cancelled midstream. And in the wake of those cuts, something stranger began to happen. Many of the same NGOs that had once criticized government policy began to soften their tone. A quiet alignment began to emerge. Editorial lines blurred. Reports became tamer. Former watchdogs became partners. Critics described it as a beginning of civil capture. Not state capture in the Zuma era sense, but foreign withdrawal creating a vacuum which the state quickly moved to fill. By mid-2025, Parliament announced it would begin directly funding certain public interest NGOs through the Department of Social Development and a new National Civil Society Grant Scheme. But the terms were clear. Applicants must be aligned to national development priorities. and demonstrates non-adversarial working relationships with government entities. In other words, behave and you'll survive. The irony was brutal. South Africa had spent years fighting off foreign state capture, only to see its civil society become vulnerable to state dependency when the donors left. And so, a deeper question emerged. Can an NGO be truly independent if its funding always comes with strings? And what happens to accountability when the last watchdogs are too hungry to bark? They don't give speeches. They don't wave flags. They don't issue press releases or hold rallies. But in South Africa's most strategic corridors, from the ports to the banks to the agricultural heartlands, Gulf monarchies have embedded themselves, not with fanfare, but through contracts, syndicates, and silent control. This is not foreign policy. This is foreign commerce dressed as policy. And it begins with the ports. In 2021, the Qatar Investment Authority, or QIA for short, entered into a low-profile agreement with a South African infrastructure consortium tied to Transnet's Durban port expansion. At face value, it looked like a developmental win. Investment into a port plagued by delays, mismanagement, and crumbling infrastructure. But buried in the procurement terms were operational exemptions. Clauses that gave preferred docking rights, expedited logistics processing, and customs handling preferences to Gulf-linked freight operators. In effect, QIA didn't just invest, it privatized efficiency in its own favor. Simultaneously, in the Northern Cape and Free State, Saudi-linked investment firms acting through shell companies registered in Mauritius and Dubai began buying up commercial farmland, particularly land with high water rights or near transport corridors. By 2023, over 180,000 hectares of productive land were under direct or indirect Gulf ownership. Some of these were managed through leaseback agreements, where South African farmers remained on site but had ceded ownership, profit share, and even crop decision-making to offshore boards. A carrot of capital, a stick of control. And the money didn't stop at land and ports. Gulf banks, particularly from the UAE and Qatar, began embedding themselves in South Africa's Islamic finance markets, a growing segment once dominated by small, local cooperative banks. By 2025, institutions like Noor Bank, Emirates NDB, and Qatar Islamic Bank were underwriting multi-million rand halal SME loans, often with governance clauses that allowed the bank to appoint a compliance auditor, essentially a board-level enforcer. In several high-value cases, these auditors acted as veto agents, shaping everything from hiring decisions to where equipment was procured. Sharia compliant? Yes. Independent? Not really. Even education wasn't immune. The Qatar Foundation, already a heavyweight in global soft power projection, entered into MOUs with UCT, UKZN, and UNISA, offering funding for postgraduate scholarships, cultural exchanges, and tech incubators. But multiple faculty members speaking anonymously described an unspoken line. Criticism of Gulf monarchies, LGBTQ issues, or Qatari geopolitical interests was discouraged, if not explicitly barred, from publicly funded panels. None of this came with tanks. None of it came with treaties. It came with spreadsheets, lawyers, and strategic silence. By 2025, South Africa's port logistics, select agricultural corridors, segments of the financial system, and parts of higher education were partially dictated, not by the state, but by foreign partners who held the purse strings. And when questioned, these deals were always defended the same way. It's just investment. It's development. It's business. But this isn't just business. Because when sovereignty becomes a commodity, the buyer eventually sets the terms. It started with whispers in parliament corridors, among unpaid ANC staffers, inside embassies where loyalty and funding quietly intersect. South Africa, in its public posture, has long supported the Palestinian cause. That much is clear, but in recent years, critics began asking a more uncomfortable question. Was this merely ideological support, or were deeper transactional relationships forming behind the scenes? And if so, with who? On October 17, 2023, just 10 days after the horrific Hamas attacks on Israel triggered a full-scale war in Gaza, South Africa's then Foreign Minister Naledi Pandor made a phone call, not to Israel, not to the United Nations, but to Ismail Haniyeh, the political leader of Hamas, an organization designated as a terrorist group by the US, EU, UK, and others. The call was confirmed by Hamas itself in an official statement claiming Pandor had expressed full support for the Palestinian people. South Africa's Department of International Relations and Cooperation, or DECO, later issued a vague clarification, stating the minister had called for peace and humanitarian access, but did not deny the conversation. The optics were unmistakable. At a moment when most of the world was condemning the massacre of Israeli civilians, South Africa was on the line with the very group responsible. Behind closed doors, deeper claims circulated. By late 2022 and into 2023, several senior ANC officials, including sources close to the Thuli House, began to leak that Iranian diplomats had provided discreet financial assistance to the ANC, particularly during a period when the party was unable to pay its staff. Staff salaries had gone unpaid for months. The party faced lawsuits from service providers and was nearing insolvency. And yet, against the odds, a bailout came. While no direct paper trail has surfaced publicly, multiple diplomatic sources across the Middle East and Africa, including intelligence-linked reports in Kenya and Ghana, claimed that Iran, via intermediaries and friendly foundations, may have transferred several $1 million to assist the ANC's operations. Some suggest it came in the form of direct cash assistance through Shia cultural or educational exchanges. Others believe it moved through regional religious networks tied to Iranian-backed non-governmental groups in Southern Africa. None of this has been confirmed officially, but critically, it also hasn't been denied by the ANC or DECO. Then came January 2024. South Africa, with Pandor again leading the charge, filed a genocide case against Israel at the International Court of Justice. The case, while rooted in real suffering in Gaza, raised strategic eyebrows. Why was South Africa, with no direct security stake in the conflict, suddenly taking the lead in a case that aligned perfectly with Iran's diplomatic war against Israel? In diplomatic circles, timing is everything, and the timing here was suspicious. The ANC was broke. Iran was under heavy Western sanctions. Hamas was being cornered militarily. And suddenly, South Africa emerged as the global face of anti-Israel legal opposition. Is that a coincidence? Or was this a form of ideological outsourcing, where Tehran, unable to wage war diplomatically under its own flag, found a willing voice in Pretoria? No hard proof has emerged linking Iran directly to the ICJ filing, but a pattern of alignment is increasingly undeniable. The ANC today is not the party of 1994. It is financially fragile, morally fragmented, dependent on donors whose identities it no longer fully discloses. In such an environment, foreign influence doesn't need to arrive with briefcases. It arrives through ideological alignment, mutual enemies, and soft obligations that harden with time. South Africa's foreign policy, once anchored in multilateralism and moral high ground, now increasingly mirrors the rhetoric and priorities of Iranian, Palestinian, and Qatari propaganda outlets, including Press TV, Al Mayadeen, and Al Jazeera. That shift may reflect real public sympathy, but it may also reflect something else: a cost of survival, a favor repaid, a deal whispered, not declared. And once again, nobody voted for it. By the time South Africans began using the phrase state capture, the Guptas had already written the manual. But what most of the country still doesn't fully grasp is this. State capture was never just a local operation. It was never just about corrupt ministers, compliant CEOs, and rigged procurement boards. Behind every shady contract and shell company was often a foreign corporation, a foreign bank, or a foreign state-linked enterprise quietly cashing in. And no case illustrates this better than Transnet. Between 2012 and 2016, Transnet signed what was supposed to be a strategic locomotive procurement deal. 1,064 trains from China South Rail and China North Rail. Original cost around 38 billion rand. Final price over 54 billion rand. The difference? Bribes, middlemen, and international complicity. Internal documents and Zondo Commission testimony confirmed that 9 billion rand in kickbacks were paid via Hong Kong and Dubai shell companies, controlled by Gupta-linked associates. Regiment's capital, Trillion, Sahara Computers. But where did the money ultimately go? A significant portion was wired to CSR's offshore affiliates, funneled through HSBC Hong Kong and Emirates NDB in Dubai. In other words, the money started in South Africa, but the beneficiaries were everywhere but South Africa. CSR later merged into CRRC, the world's largest rail company, claimed ignorance. But emails obtained by whistleblowers showed direct communication between South African fixers and Chinese executives, coordinating consulting fees for facilitating the deals. This wasn't just a Gupta crime spree. This was foreign-enabled looting, with Beijing looking the other way. Then came McKinsey. In 2015, the global consultancy firm signed a lucrative contract with Eskom to deliver cost-cutting and efficiency services. But instead of cutting costs, they partnered with Trillion Capital, a Gupta-linked financial outlet with no proven credentials, and together drained over 1.6 billion rand from Eskom's books. McKinsey later claimed it had no idea Trillion was compromised, but internal memos showed concerns were raised months before payments began. The US Department of Justice forced McKinsey to pay back over $122 million in fines. Yet, in South Africa, accountability came much slower. Even Swiss engineering firms, German software providers, and Indian tech companies were found to have entered cozy relationships with captured SOEs, always using local BEE fronts as buffers to appear legitimate. The state wasn't just captured by its own politicians. It was captured by international players who knew how to play the rules, how to grease the right palms, and how to disappear once the money cleared. And that's what made State Capture 2.0 different. It wasn't just about theft. It was about sovereignty for sale, with the world lined up to buy. South Africans were told that corruption was a local cancer, but the tumor had global veins. And while a few Guptas made the headlines, the real money, the deep, long-term contracts and asset seizures vanished offshore, beyond the reach of any commission or courts. It didn't happen with tanks. There was no invasion, no coup, no midnight decree. No flags were lowered, no constitutions were burned, no sovereignty was revoked. And yet, something was taken. Over 2 decades, South Africa has slowly been written into the orbit of foreign agendas, not by force, but by familiarity. The ports are not captured, but they are leased. The media is not silenced, but it is softened. The economy is not colonized, but it is brokered, piece by piece. And as citizens argue over statues, elections, or party manifestos, a different government is already at work. One that sits in donor boardrooms, embassy corridors, trade delegations, and strategic partner luncheons. This is not paranoia. It is the price of not paying attention. Because when a country doesn't defend its sovereignty, someone else will buy it. Not with war, but with debt, data, dependency, and deals nobody ever voted for.